Hello, and welcome to this edition of Synth Masterclass with computer music. This time we're going to be using our ZebraCM plugin to create a very cool synth patch, which we're calling Gated Sequence Synth. We're going to be using two LFOs from the ZebraCM to control different aspects of modulation within the synth. We'll begin as we normally do by initializing the plugin, and we do this by going to the display which is at the top of the plugin window, clicking and coming down to Init at the bottom. This will initialize the plugin. We're also going to turn the master volume down on the whole synthesizer, which we do by going to the bottom right hand side where we see a pot with master written above it, and this time we're going to turn it down to a value of 70. Now if you're new to this plugin, it's a good idea to watch out for the values that you see in the upper display. Every time we make an alteration to a pot, we'll see a value displayed there, and we'll be referring to those throughout this tutorial. We're going to start creating our patch predictably with oscillator number 1. By default, the volume of oscillator 1 is turned up to 100, and we can leave that where it is, but we want to change the shape of the waveform. So moving to the waveform display, click and hold with the mouse and drag it up until you see a value in the upper display of 6.40. We're only going to be using one oscillator for this patch, but we can thicken it up by aliasing the waveform. We do this by going to the numbers which are located in the top left-hand corner of the oscillator section. And where there's a number 2, if we click on it, it becomes highlighted in turquoise. This means we're going to hear two aliased waveforms. If we hear the aliased waveforms together, they sound a little bit phasey. So one of the things we can do to alleviate that problem is move to the detune pot and set a value. We're going to just set a subtle value of +1. This patch is going to exploit 3 different types of modulation, all emanating from the low frequency oscillator section. We can start putting some of these routings in place, beginning with, once again, oscillator number 1. If we go to the pot, which is directly below the waveform display, you'll see that we have the ability to assign it. So click on the little drop-down menu below the pot and select LFO1. Once we've done that, we can then go to the wave pot and set it to a value of 2.0. When we now play the patch, we'll hear a degree of modulation. It doesn't actually sound very nice at the moment, but don't worry, we're going to do something about that. It's now time to start sculpting our sound using the filter section. So move over to the filter section on the far right hand side of the plugin and start by selecting from the drop down menu the filter type which is called LP Excite. LP means it's a low pass filter, and Excite means it's got some exaggerated frequency content, as you can see from this waveform display. We can now go to the cutoff control and set this to a value of 89. Right next door to the cutoff control, we've got the resonance control, and we want to set that to a number 10. And again, right next door to resonance, we have the overdrive control. And we're just going to put a little bit of overdrive on the sound, which will just help to warm things up a little bit. Set this to a value of 23. We can now put in our second aspect of modulation, which we're going to apply to the filter section. Move to the user-assigned pot, which is currently assigned to envelope 2. Click on the drop-down and select LFO1. Having assigned that signal path, we can now change the value of the pot to number 32. We now have a sound like this, which is still sounding a little bit unpalatable, but we're about to do something about that right now. We're now going to head to the LFO section and start working with LFO number 1. You know that you have LFO1 selected because it's highlighted in turquoise. Just to the left of the turquoise numbering, you'll see that it says LFO waveform. We want to click on the drop-down that currently reads Sine and select User. We're going to change a couple of settings in this LFO section, beginning with the sync setting, which we need to change to a 16th note. At the bottom of the LFO window, you can see that it says Steps. You can also see that it says 16 points. You can change this if you want to, but we're going to leave it set to 16 for the moment. This actually refers to the number of points that we've got on the LFO display here. We want to create an entire sequence over the course of one bar of 4/4, therefore we want 16 points. It's at this stage where we need to draw in the waveform that we would like. So quite simply, all we're doing here is dragging up and down each of the steps that we have here. And once you have something that you feel might be to your liking, just try auditioning it by playing a note. So you can hear what's happening to this sound. We have two routings from LFO1, one going to the cutoff frequency within the filter section, and the second one is going back to the oscillator, which is changing the position of the waveform. At the moment, it's a little bit on the exaggerated side, but we can do something about that by changing the amplitude of the low frequency oscillator. So heading back to the LFO section, you'll see right at the bottom it says amplitude, and we're going to reduce that pot to a value of around about 67. Although you might want to play around with that because it really depends on how exaggerated your waveform is as to how much effect that has. If we play our sound now, it should sound a little bit more subtle. And you also might decide that you want to tweak the odd step within the LFO because it's not quite as you want it. Next, we're going to turn our attention to LFO number 2. So moving back to the LFO section, make sure you now have the number 2 highlighted in turquoise. Once again, we're going to make some alterations. First thing we want to do is change the sync to 16th note. And the second thing we want to do is change the waveform from the currently selected sine to a sawtooth down. Now at the moment, we don't actually have a routing for LFO2, but we're going to create one now. LFO2 is going to be triggering a little bit of a volume gate, so we're going to send it in the direction of the main volume output, which is over in the global section on the left-hand side of the plugin. Making sure that your volume is all the way up to 100, which it should be by default, we then go to the tiny little turquoise dot, which is just to the right of the volume control. Click on it and set your routing for LFO2. You can then click and hold on it and set a value which we want to set to number 62. Having done that, we now should have some sawtooth gating being applied to the volume of the patch. And that gives it that sort of punchy sound that we're hearing there. Finally, we just need to make a very subtle alteration to the envelope. We think the envelope is more or less as we want it. If you remember, envelope 1 controls the amplitude of our sound, and we're going to leave most of these settings where they are. That means that attack will be set to 0. That means that decay will be set to 50. Sustain will be set to 80. But we're going to increase the release phase to around about 30. Now, because of the nature of this patch, there's obviously a long way that you could go with it in terms of tweaking it to your own settings. You might choose to go back to LFO1 and change the sync settings from 16th note to, say, an 8th note. If you want more of a triplet-y type feel, you might want to go to something like 8th note triplet. You may also want to fine-tune the positioning of the user waveform so that it suits your purpose. And you need to just audition and listen within the production that you're working on. You could also obviously add some back-end effects, and we've got a few in place here that we might recommend. First of all, put in a compressor because that will keep things nicely under control. Always helpful when you've got quite a variance of filter volume, as we have with this patch, with all the movement of the cutoff frequency. We've also put in a stereo delay, which we're generating from the Soundtoys Echo Boy. And also, we've just popped in a little bit of reverb on the back end, which is coming from FabFilter's new Pro Reverb 2. Pull all of that together, and we end up with this. So that's it for this tutorial, and we'll see you next time.